There is a place where the ocean does not rush, where the water slows, as if it is listening. Tonight we are going there. You don't need to imagine anything yet. Just allow the sound of my voice to stay with you. Long ago, on a quiet stretch of coast, a lighthouse kept its light burning every night. And one evening, something answered that light. This is the story of a man who kept the light, and the ship that came for it. Settle in. There is nowhere else you need to be. There is a place where the sea grows still. Not calm, exactly. Still, as if the water has decided to pause, to breathe, to wait for something that hasn't arrived yet. This is where our story begins. And I'd like you to settle in. Find yourself comfortable. Let your shoulders relax into whatever holds you. The night is long, and we have time. All the time we need. The man's name was Samuel, though you might forget that as the story unfolds, and that's perfectly fine. Names are less important than the quiet spaces between them. Samuel was a keeper of small things. He kept records, tides and dates, weather patterns, and the arrival of fishing boats. For 30 years he had lived in a lighthouse on the coast of something unnamed, some territory between sleep and waking, where stories grow best. The lighthouse stood on a promontory, a curved finger of dark rock pointing toward the horizon. Samuel's job was simple. He maintained the light. He kept the lens clean. He trimmed the wick. He wrote in his logbook each evening. These tasks occupied his hands and left his mind wonderfully free to wander. It was during one of these wanderings, on an evening in late September, that he noticed something different about the horizon. The air smelled of copper and salt. The sky held the last light of the sun, that soft gold that makes the world look unfinished, as if creation had paused halfway through and simply decided the halfway point was enough. Samuel stepped outside the lighthouse. His logbook hung loose in his hand. The wind moved through the trees with a sound like turning pages, and there, between the dark water and the darkening sky, he saw a shape. Not a ship, precisely. Not yet a ship. More the idea of a ship, the suggestion of one. He blinked. It remained. For many years, Samuel had been told that the human eye can deceive in low light. He had read about the tricks of dusk, the way shadows can consolidate themselves into forms that seem purposeful, seem directed, seem almost alive. But he had also learned that his eyes had become trustworthy instruments over the long years of keeping the light. The shape was still there. It was made of wood. He could somehow sense that. Old wood. The kind that has spent decades absorbing salt and sun and the simple passing of time. The kind of wood that has learned patience. The shape was moving, or the water beneath it was moving, or perhaps they were moving together, in agreement, the way old companions learn to move in sync without discussion. Samuel did not feel afraid. This surprised him, though he did not let the surprise stay long. Fear, he had learned, was often just the mind's way of announcing that something was outside its categories. Once the shock of that announcement faded, the mind often settled. He stood and watched as the shape drew closer. Hours passed, or perhaps minutes. The mind can lose its sense of duration when given permission to do so. The shape resolved itself gradually into something with structure. There were lines that suggested a hull, a form that suggested a cabin, masts that rose like thin fingers asking questions of the sky. The ship moved silently. Samuel had lived on the coast long enough to know the sounds ships made. The creak and groan of wooden joints, the snap of canvas, the complaints of rigging, the thousand small protests that a wooden vessel makes as it argues with the wind and water. This ship made none of these sounds. It moved as if it had learned to move without sound, as if the ocean had agreed to carry it gently. Samuel climbed back into the lighthouse. He lit the lamp as he always did. The mechanism was familiar beneath his hands. The oil flowed. The wick caught. The light began its slow rotation, casting its beam out across the water in steady, rhythmic passes. He waited to see if the light would illuminate the ship. When the beam swept across the water where the ship had been, Samuel saw nothing. When it swept back, the ship was there again. Not frightened, but curious now, Samuel descended to his small cottage beside the lighthouse. He poured himself a glass of water from the well. He sat at his wooden table. He opened his logbook, and he wrote, "Evening, late September. Unusual vessel observed, wooden, silent, appears and disappears with the rotation of the light." He paused, his pen hovering over the paper. Then he added, "Its arrival feels intentional, like a visit, like being called upon." He set the pen down. He did not sleep that night. When the sun rose, the ship was gone. Samuel stood on the promontory in the pale morning light and scanned the horizon. Nothing, only the normal water, the normal boats in the distance, moving their normal courses, catching the light in normal ways. He felt a peculiar sensation, not quite disappointment, something softer than that, something like the feeling of waking from a dream that had seemed entirely real, and then realizing that some dreams are more real in their own way than waking life could ever be. The sun climbed. Samuel made breakfast, bread and cheese, an apple. He ate slowly, thinking of nothing in particular. The afternoon came. He trimmed the lamp. He cleaned the lens. He wrote his observations. The regular work filled the day with its own kind of purpose, and by evening Samuel found that the night before had begun to feel like something from a different life. Perhaps he had imagined it. The mind, left alone too long, sometimes invents company. But as the sun descended again, Samuel felt a familiar stirring in his chest. Something between hope and question. An opening. He climbed to the top of the lighthouse. He waited. The light began its rotation. The beam began its sweep. And there, at the horizon, the shape was returning. This time Samuel was ready with his telescope. The ship rose out of the darkness as the light found it. Old. That was the first thing the telescope told him. Older than ships were supposed to be. The wood had the color of something that had surrendered to the ocean long ago but had not quite sunk. It hung between states, between being and memory. The sails were furled, the rigging was intact, but it hung with a strange looseness, as if it had forgotten what it was supposed to hold. There were windows, small square windows along what must have been the captain's cabin. And in one of those windows, Samuel saw something that made him lower the telescope. A light, not the reflection of his lighthouse. This light came from inside the cabin. It was warm and amber, the color of candlelight or oil lamps. Someone or something had kindled a light inside the ship. Samuel watched for a long time. The light did not move. It did not flicker as normal flame would. It simply burned, steady and patient, like a beacon answering his beacon. When the lighthouse beam swept away, the ship vanished again into darkness. When the beam returned, it was there, and the light still burned in the cabin window. This repeated for hours. Toward midnight, Samuel went down to his cottage and made tea. He sat with the hot cup in his hands, steam rising past his face. The cottage was warm. Outside, he could hear the wind moving. The night was alive with its ordinary sounds, and beneath those sounds, or perhaps within them, Samuel felt something else, a question that had been asked of him, not with words, with presence, with the simple fact of showing up night after night, a ship returning to the same place with the same quiet insistence. What did it want? Or perhaps more accurately, what did it need him to know? Samuel was an old man. He had lived alone for long enough that solitude had become his first language. Other people, when they visited, often seemed to him like they were speaking in dialects of something he used to understand but had mostly forgotten. But there was another kind of language, the language of the tides, the language of light and darkness, the language of things that appear and disappear according to their own patterns. The ship was speaking in that language, and Samuel, though he did not know it yet, was beginning to understand. By the third night, Samuel had begun to accept that something unusual was happening. This acceptance came with a kind of peace. He climbed the stairs of the lighthouse without checking the telescope. He lit the lamp. He watched the rotation begin. When the light swept across the water, the ship was waiting. It had drawn closer, close enough now that Samuel could see details without the telescope. The name on the hull. Though it was weathered and faded, he could make out the letters. The Meridian. It was a name he recognized, though not from any direct knowledge. It was the name he had learned about years ago. A ship that had left port nearly a century before. A ship that had been lost in a storm. The crew was presumed drowned. The wreck had never been found. But there it was. Samuel felt something move in his chest. Not fear. Something deeper and quieter than fear. Something like recognition. He found himself descending the lighthouse stairs without consciously deciding to do so. His legs carried him down, down, down. The spiral stone beneath his feet. The cool wall beneath his fingertips. He was going to the beach. It was something he had not done in years. The beach was not part of his duties. The beach was where the boundary between the known and unknown became less clear. Samuel had long ago learned to prefer clarity. But tonight, clarity seemed less important than answer. The night was moonless but full of stars, the stars reflected in the water, so that Samuel could not tell where the sky ended and the ocean began. He was walking through space, through infinite darkness studded with light. The sand was cool beneath his feet. He had removed his shoes without noticing, and there, close enough now to see clearly, was the ship. It was no longer transparent, no longer something that appeared and disappeared with the sweep of the light. It was present, fully, completely present. The water held it gently. It rode the small waves with the patience of something that had learned to accept the nature of water. Samuel could smell it now, the smell of old wood, the smell of salt and sea air and something else, something like memory itself has an odor. Like time had taken on a physical presence and was floating above the water. The cabin windows still glowed with that warm amber light. Samuel walked into the water. It was cold, colder than he would have expected. It stole his breath. But he continued, one step at a time, wading deeper. The sand beneath his feet gave way to rock, then to nothing. But he did not sink. The water held him. It buoyed him up. And he realized with the sense of wonder rather than confusion that he was walking on the water, not because he had become anything other than himself, not because the laws of the world had changed, but because they had both agreed, the water and Samuel, on a different kind of truth for tonight, a truth in which some things were possible that were not possible in daylight, in which the rules that governed the daytime were suspended in favor of other, older rules. He drew closer to the ship. At this distance he could see the weathering clearly. Not decay exactly. Change. The wood had become something other than what it had been, without ceasing to be itself. There was a rope ladder hanging down the side. Samuel knew it must have been there all along, though he had not seen it with the telescope. Some things show themselves only when you are close enough. His hands reached up. They grasped the rope. The ladder held. He began to climb, hand over hand. The rope was thick and textured. It smelled of tar and salt and age. His shoulders remembered how to climb, though it had been decades since they had practiced. And he pulled himself up, over the rail, and onto the deck of the ship. The deck was empty, but it was not abandoned. There was a quality to the emptiness. It was full of something. Something like waiting. Something like anticipation. Samuel stood in the center of the deck. The ship swayed gently beneath his feet. Above, the stars wheeled slowly through their appointed courses. The cabin door stood open. That warm light spilled out of it. It moved as he watched, not flickering but moving nonetheless, as if the person who had kindled it was moving about inside, performing some task, some work that required the light. Samuel walked toward the open door. His heart was not racing. His palms were not sweating. He felt instead a profound calm, as if he had been waiting his entire life to have this moment occur, and now that it was occurring, it seemed the most natural thing in the world. He stepped through the doorway. Inside, the cabin was warm. A fire burned in a small stove. Books lined the shelves. Maps hung on the walls. A desk held papers, instruments, a compass, a sextant, things for navigation and record-keeping. And at the desk, his back to Samuel, sat a figure. Samuel could not quite see the features. The light from the fire cast the figure in silhouette, but he could see the posture, the shoulders, the way the head was bowed over the papers as if deeply concentrating. The figure did not move. Samuel stood in the doorway and waited. He did not know what he was waiting for, perhaps for the figure to speak, perhaps for the figure to turn around, perhaps simply for understanding to arrive in its own time, the way it always did if you waited patiently enough. And then the figure did something. It took up a pen. It dipped it into ink. It began to write. The scratching sound was small and clear in the warm silence of the cabin. Samuel could see that there was a logbook on the desk, just like his own. The figure was making an entry. Back and forth, the pen moved, letters forming, words taking shape. And Samuel, though he could not quite make out the words themselves, could sense their meaning. The figure was writing about him. Not about Samuel specifically, but about a man who kept a light, a man who had learned to live with solitude, a man who had kept his records faithfully for 30 years, a man who had opened himself to something strange and inexplicable. And as the pen moved, Samuel understood something that he had been approaching gradually for the last 3 days. The ship was not here by accident. The ship was here because he had kept the light. Not his lighthouse light specifically, but something else. Some quality of attention, some willingness to remain present and faithful to a task even when the task seemed small and the rest of the world had moved on to other things. There were places where certain lights were still needed, places between things, between the world of the living and the world of memory, between the specific and the infinite. And those lights had to be kept by someone. They had to be kept by someone who understood the value of solitude, who had learned to live without requiring the constant reassurance of other voices, who could maintain a light without needing to know exactly who or what would see it. The pen continued its scratching. Samuel walked further into the cabin. He did not walk around to see the figure's face. Some things were best left in shadow. Some mysteries were more true the longer they remained mysterious. Instead, he found a second chair. He sat down, and there, in the warm cabin of the impossible ship at the edge of the world, Samuel waited. The figure wrote on, page after page. Outside, the stars continued their turning. The water continued its gentle rocking. The lighthouse beam, far away on the promontory, continued its rotation, casting its light out across the dark water, asking and answering questions that only the night could hear. Samuel did not sleep, but neither was he awake in the way he had been awake before. He existed in a state between, and in that state time moved differently. Minutes became hours that became minutes again. The writing continued, and gradually, as Samuel sat and simply witnessed this process, as he allowed the strangeness of the moment to settle into his bones and become familiar, he felt something transform within himself. It was not quite understanding, but it was something close. Something like the feeling of finally reading a familiar passage and seeing something in it you had missed 100 times before. The ship had come to him because it needed to, and he had opened himself to its arrival because some part of him had always been waiting. There were other lighthouses, he realized, other keepers, other people who maintained the small, essential lights that held the boundary between things. And sometimes, on certain nights, those ships that carried the memories and the echoes and the unfinished stories of the world would arrive at those lights, needing something, needing witness, needing acknowledgement, needing to know that someone was still keeping the light. The Meridian had been lost at sea nearly a century ago, but it had not ceased to be. It had simply become something else, a ship of memory, a vessel that existed primarily in the spaces between other things. It sailed an ocean that was not on any map. It kept its own course by the light of its own stars, and occasionally, very occasionally, it returned to the places where it had been seen before, to the places where someone still kept a light. Samuel understood this now. He did not know how he understood it, but understanding, he had learned, did not always require explanation. Sometimes it simply required presence, the willingness to sit in the same room as a mystery and allow it to be mysterious. The pen finished its work. The figure set it down. The writing was complete. And then, very slowly, the figure began to turn. Samuel kept his eyes gentle and his heart open. He was ready for whatever he would see. But what he saw was something more surprising than a face. What he saw was light, pure light, not the golden light of the fire, not the amber light of the lamp, but light itself, the raw material of visibility, the thing that makes all seeing possible. And in that light, Samuel could see everything. He could see the ship as it had been, full of crew and cargo, setting out from a port 200 years before. He could see the storm that had claimed it, the water that had seemed angry but was only behaving according to its nature. He could see the crew members as they sank, not in fear but in acceptance, understanding even then that some journeys do not end so much as they transform. He could see the ship as it had learned over decades to exist in the spaces between. He could see the other keepers scattered across the world, maintaining their lights. He could see the pattern beneath the pattern, the reason why these lights were needed, the way that the world required boundary keepers, people who stood in the threshold spaces and held the line, allowing the known and the unknown to remain distinct and yet connected. He could see that this had always been his true work, not just the light he maintained in the lighthouse, but the quality of attention he had brought to his solitude, the way he had learned to befriend the darkness rather than resist it, the way he had kept his questions open instead of closing them with false certainty. All of that had been the true light, the one that the ship had been following, the one that had called it here. And now that he understood this, now that he could see the whole pattern, Samuel felt something release within him, a burden he had not known he was carrying. The loneliness that came not from lack of company, but from lack of understanding. The sense that his solitude must mean something was wrong with him. The fear that by choosing to remain alone, he had somehow failed at life. All of that dissolved in the presence of that light, because he understood now that he had not failed. He had been called to something specific. He had answered that call with his life. And this ship, arriving night after night at the horizon of his world, was the universe confirming that his answer had been heard, that his work mattered, that by keeping his light he was keeping something essential alive. The light began to fade, not dimming but drawing back, returning to wherever it had come from. The figure was no longer visible, or perhaps it had never been a figure at all. Perhaps it had always been this light. Perhaps light was the only true form of whatever inhabited the ship. Samuel stood up from his chair. He walked to the cabin door, and he looked out at the deck, and at the water, and at the lighthouse beam still rotating in the distance. Everything looked the same as it had before, and yet everything was different. Because Samuel was different. He had been answered. His question, the one he had been carrying for 30 years without knowing it was a question, had finally been addressed. He descended the rope ladder carefully. His feet found the water, and the water held him, and he walked back toward the shore. Behind him, the ship began to fade, not disappearing the way it had when the lighthouse beam swept past, but fading in a different way, fading into acceptance, into completion, into the knowledge that it had accomplished what it came to accomplish. Samuel waded back to the beach. His feet found sand beneath them again. Real sand, sand from this world. He climbed out of the water and stood for a moment, dripping and cold, and more alive than he had felt in years. The night was still dark. The stars were still there. The lighthouse beam was still rotating. Everything had changed. Nothing had changed. Samuel walked back to his cottage. He did not remember putting on his shoes, but they were on his feet when he looked down. He did not remember the path, but his feet found it. He did not remember lighting a lamp, but a lamp was burning inside the cottage when he stepped through the door. He went to his desk. He opened his logbook. He picked up his pen, and he wrote, "Late September. The ship has come and gone. The mystery has made itself known. I am no longer uncertain about my purpose. The light has been answered. All is well. All will continue to be well." He set the pen down, and then, as the first light of dawn began to paint the eastern sky with color, Samuel slept. His sleep was deep. His sleep was dreamless. His sleep was the sleep of someone who had finally come to rest, knowing that rest was deserved, and knowing that when he woke, his work would still be there waiting, and it would have meaning, and that would be enough. When Samuel woke, it was afternoon. The sun slanted through the windows of his cottage. Dust motes floated lazily in the light. Everything was exactly as it had always been. He made coffee. He drank it slowly. He ate bread and cheese. Then he climbed the lighthouse stairs. He checked the lamp. The oil was low. He refilled it. He cleaned the lens. He made his regular observations and wrote them in his logbook, as he had done countless times before. Evening came. Samuel sat in his favorite chair and watched the sun descend toward the horizon. The sky turned gold, then purple, then the deep blue of approaching night. The stars began to appear, and when it was fully dark, Samuel lit the lamp. The mechanism was familiar beneath his hands, as it always was. The light began its rotation. The beam began its sweep, and Samuel watched. The horizon remained empty. The ship did not return, and this too was exactly as it should be. Some visitors come once. Their coming is enough. The meaning does not require repetition. Samuel understood this. He had not expected the ship to return. He had understood in that moment of pure light in the cabin that the ship had come with a message, and the message had been delivered. And that was the end of that story. But other stories, he sensed, were beginning. Not stories of impossible ships, perhaps, but stories of living, of continuing, of maintaining the light with a new sense of purpose, of knowing on the nights when loneliness threatened to overwhelm him that his solitude was not a failure, that his faithfulness mattered, that somewhere in the spaces between things his light was being seen. Samuel descended the lighthouse stairs. He walked back to his cottage. He sat at his desk, and he began to write something that was not in his logbook. It was a journal, a different kind of record, not of tides and times and observations, but of thoughts, of the night the ship had come, of the understanding that had arrived with it, of the way that solitude, properly lived, could be a form of service. He wrote by candlelight. His pen moved slowly across the paper, and the words came, gentle and true, the way words come when they are given time and attention, and the space to arrive. He wrote late into the night, and when he finally set the pen down and climbed to his narrow bed in the corner of the cottage, his sleep was restful. His dreams, if he had them, were his own. And the lighthouse beam continued its rotation, asking and answering the questions of the night, as it would continue to do, long after Samuel's hands had stopped keeping it. Some lights burn only for their time, but they burn truly, and that is enough. In the weeks that followed, Samuel's life returned to its customary patterns. He kept the light. He kept his records. He maintained the lens and replaced the oil. But something had altered in the fundamental character of his days. The work no longer felt like duty performed out of obligation. It felt like prayer, like a conversation conducted over decades with something vast and patient and kind. He had always kept the light, but now he kept it knowing it was kept for a reason. He began to notice other signs, small things. A boat passing in the harbor, slowing as if to acknowledge the lighthouse. A bird landing on the rail, resting before continuing its migration, as if the light had given it direction. A night when the stars aligned in a particular way, and Samuel could have sworn he felt the presence of something watching. He kept his new journal faithfully. He wrote about these observations. He wrote about his thoughts. He wrote about the understanding that had arrived, unbidden, in the cabin of the impossible ship. And over time, through the act of writing about it, the experience became less strange. It became integrated into his sense of who he was and what his life meant. It became part of the story he told himself about himself, not as the interruption of a mundane life, but as the revelation of what his life had always been. A choice made long ago to stand in a specific place and keep a specific light, not for recognition, not for understanding from others, but because something in him had known, even before he understood it consciously, that this was his work, that this was his reason. Months passed, then a year. Samuel was older now. He could feel it in his joints when he climbed the lighthouse stairs, in the way his hands sometimes trembled as he held the pen. But this aging felt natural, accepted. He had learned to welcome change the way the water welcomed the phases of the moon. One evening in the spring following the ship's arrival, Samuel made a decision. He wrote a letter. It was addressed to the authority that oversaw the lighthouse, the government office in the distant city that managed the light. He explained that he could not maintain his position much longer. That age was claiming him, slowly but certainly, that the lighthouse would need a new keeper. He asked them to find someone who could live alone, someone who did not require constant company, someone who could understand that the light was more important than comfort, someone who could hear a call, even if the call came in silence. He did not explain what he meant by that last part. He simply wrote the words and trusted that whoever read them would understand what needed to be understood. He sent the letter, and then he waited. Weeks became months. Finally, a response arrived. They would send someone, a replacement, someone they believed could do the work. He would be pensioned off. He could retire to a cottage in the city if he wished. They were grateful for his decades of service. They enclosed a formal letter of thanks and a small sum of money. Samuel read the letter and felt no regret. He was ready to let go, ready to trust that the light would continue. Ready to believe that someone else would arrive and would understand the deep reason why this light needed to be kept. Or perhaps they would not understand it. Perhaps they would simply keep the light faithfully and without question for 30 years, until understanding arrived one night in a ship that knew how to sail between worlds. Either way, the light would be kept, and that was enough. The new keeper arrived on a clear morning in late May. He was younger than Samuel, perhaps 30 years old. He was quiet. He asked few questions. He looked at the lighthouse, at the mechanisms, at the logbook, and he nodded. Samuel showed him everything: how to fill the oil, how to clean the lens, how to calculate the times for lighting and extinguishing, how to make the observations and record them. The younger man listened with careful attention. He did not take notes, but Samuel could see that he was memorizing. When the tour was complete, they stood at the top of the lighthouse, looking out at the horizon. The sea was bright in the afternoon sun. Seabirds wheeled and called. A fishing boat moved toward the harbor. Everything was normal and ordinary and beautiful. "Why does this work matter?" the younger keeper asked. It was the first personal question he had asked. Samuel considered the question. He could have given the practical answer. Ships need the light. The light prevents wrecks. The light saves lives. All of that was true, but it was not the answer the young man needed to hear. "Because," Samuel said slowly, "there are places in the world where boundaries are important, places where the known and the unknown need to remain distinct. This light stands in such a place. Keeping it means you understand that some work is not done for recognition or reward. It is done because it matters, because something in you responds to the call to do it." The young man nodded. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I had a dream before I came here. I was being called to a specific place. I didn't know where the place was. But when I was offered this position, I knew. This is where the dream was calling me." Samuel felt something settle in his chest, a sense of rightness. This young man would understand. Not immediately, perhaps, but given time, given the gift of solitude that this place offered, he would understand. And one night, if he was patient and faithful, his own ship would arrive, and he would learn what Samuel had learned, that the light he kept was part of something larger, something that moved beneath the surface of the ordinary world, something that required witnesses and keepers and people willing to stand in threshold spaces and be faithful. "You'll do well here," Samuel said. The young man smiled. It was a small smile, but it was genuine. "Thank you," he said, "for keeping it for me until I arrived." Samuel felt his eyes grow warm. He did not cry. He was too old for that kind of sentiment. But he felt the gratitude, deep and true, moving through him. Together they descended the lighthouse stairs. That evening, Samuel packed his few belongings. He did not have much. 40 years of accumulation, but lived simply, amounted to very little. Books, some clothes, his journals. The young keeper helped him carry things to a small cart that had been arranged to take him to the city. As the sun descended, Samuel took one last look at the lighthouse. It stood against the sky just as it always had, eternal and patient. He thought of the ship. He thought of the light that had been pure light. He thought of all the nights he had kept the beam burning, without knowing why, but faithfully nonetheless. And he felt peace, the kind of peace that comes when you finally understand that everything you have done has meaning. The cart began to move. Samuel did not look back. Looking back would have changed the meaning somehow. Would have suggested that he was leaving something behind, rather than moving forward into the next part of a journey that had never really interrupted itself. The road carried him inland, away from the coast. Behind him, the lighthouse beam began its evening rotation. A new keeper was keeping the light now. A new pair of hands would maintain the mechanisms. A new pair of eyes would watch the horizon. And sometime, perhaps months from now, perhaps years from now, a ship would arrive at that coast. A ship made of old wood and patient water and the accumulated memories of the lost. And the new keeper would see it. And he would have to decide whether to open himself to mystery or to dismiss it as imagination. Samuel did not know which choice the young man would make, but he knew that the choice was waiting, and that was enough. The cart moved on. The sun continued its descent. Night was coming, and somewhere behind him a light was burning. A light that would continue burning long after Samuel's hands had stopped keeping it. A light that would burn on, faithfully and without question, for another 30 years, or 40, or until it found another keeper and another one after that. A light that had always been burning and would always burn. Because some lights are too important to let go out, and because there are always people willing to keep them. People who have heard a call they cannot quite name. People who have answered with their life. People who understand that the most important work is often the work no one sees. The work done in solitude, the work done in faithfulness, the work done because something inside you knows it matters. Samuel settled back in his cart. The road stretched ahead. The night was coming, and everything was exactly as it should be. Everything was in its right place, and in the spaces between places where the impossible ships sailed and the mysteries kept their patient watch. The universe was humming with the knowledge that it was being seen, that it was being kept, that there were still those willing to hold the light. And that was reason enough for hope. That was reason enough for peace. That was reason enough for all of it to continue, as it always had, as it always would. Beneath the stars and beyond the horizon, in the places where stories go to rest.